Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On the cold morning of October 1972, a plane took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, heading towards Santiago, Chile. On board were a rugby team made up of Uruguayan players along with their friends, families, and a few other passengers. All of them were traveling to Chile for an important match. The team had chosen to travel together in order to boost their morale before the challenging game. The plane was one of the airline's newest and most modern aircraft. The passengers settled into their seats comfortably, with some sipping champagne, while others chatted with friends. The cabin crew gave safety instructions as the plane ascended. At first, everything was smooth. The sky was clear, and the setting sun on the horizon put all the passengers at ease. However, this calm atmosphere soon turned to uncertainty as the plane climbed higher. The darkening sky and thickening fog started to obscure their view. Before long, the pilots noticed anomalies on their radar. The weather was rapidly deteriorating, with thick clouds and fog reducing visibility. As they approached the foothills of the Andes Mountains, the pilots realized that the weather conditions were only going to get worse. As the plane continued its course towards the mountains, the pilots, experienced in flying under such conditions, decided to press on. Communication with air traffic control was maintained to find the best descent route, but the conditions were worsening. Meanwhile, the passengers began to notice the growing intensity of the fog outside. Many leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse of the snowy mountain peaks, but some started to feel uneasy due to the strange atmosphere inside the plane. The wind grew stronger, and some passengers felt the plane slightly shake. However, most remained calm, dismissing it as a usual turbulence they had experienced many times before. As they fastened their seatbelts and started talking about the difficulties of the flight, the plane suddenly shook violently. In an instant, everything changed. The plane continued to shake and then suddenly began to drop with a terrifying noise. The pilots experienced a rapid loss of speed. Without any further explanation, the plane began to rise and fall on its own. The passengers, gripped by fear, clutched their seatbelts tightly. Some passengers, unable to believe the plane could continue its flight under these conditions, squeezed their eyes shut and began to pray. Moments later, the plane collided with the peak of a mountain and began to fall. With a loud crash, the plane slammed into the steep slopes of the Andes Mountains. Upon impact, the cargo compartments opened, scattering items and passengers throughout the cabin. The plane took a heavy blow and collided with a rock before coming to a halt. Inside, passengers experienced a violent jolt, with some hitting their heads hard. However, the fatal impact was not the end. Many passengers were miraculously still alive, but they found themselves surrounded by total darkness. The fog, accompanied by fierce winds from the mountains, covered the entire area, engulfing everything around the plane. In the first few seconds, many passengers lay motionless, trying to comprehend the horror they had just experienced. Only the faint movements of hands and the fear in their eyes were visible. The cabin lights had gone out, and in the eerie silence, passengers realized they had fallen into a dark abyss, surrounded by swirling snow and fog. Only a small group of survivors remained. The majority of the plane was in pieces, but a few brave passengers gathered the courage to check on the others. There were several bodies and injured passengers. The others lay completely still. The survivors huddled together, doing their best to help, but no one was in any condition to offer real assistance. They could feel the weight of the surrounding silence growing heavier with each passing minute. This horrifying crash would mark the beginning of a nightmare, not just for the survivors, but for the world as well. This group, attempting to reach Chile, was now stranded in the peaks of the Andes Mountains, facing an unimaginable struggle for survival in the wake of a devastating disaster. But at that moment, no one could have predicted what was to come. The only reality that remained was this: the fight for survival had begun. The first few seconds after the crash were a nightmare for the survivors. After the plane crashed into the steep slopes of the Andes Mountains, darkness and silence took over. Most of the passengers fell to the ground in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Among the wreckage of metal parts and shattered glass, the survivors were suddenly confronted with a massive silence. At that moment, they tried to understand what to do, where they were, and how to stay alive. A group of brave passengers, despite being injured, immediately started to assess their surroundings. Their eyes blindly searched the darkness as many relied on their survival instincts to do what they could. The few medical supplies and food available on the plane were quickly gathered by the luckier ones. There were only a few snacks. Most of the drinks had spilled and scattered before the plane went down. However, a few fortunate individuals found a couple of boxes of emergency medical supplies and medicine, but these were not enough to ensure their survival. At first, the survivors tried to spend some time tending to their wounds and offering each other encouragement. They realized that many passengers had sustained serious injuries and some had already died. All that remained before them was the wreckage of the frozen, shattered plane. In the middle of the mountains, it seemed there was nothing to survive on. In that moment, they realized that their only option was to help each other. While many spoke courageously to boost morale, others were trying to come up with a survival plan. As time passed, the passengers' psychology was put to the test. The cold, rapidly dropping temperatures and snowstorms made them even more desperate. In the early hours of the night, the snowfall intensified, and the wind from the mountain peaks made the cold feel even more unbearable. The survivors huddled together to try to stay warm. Some passengers shared the clothes they had, attempting to share body heat. The injured and dead passengers scattered around the wreckage of the plane were motionless in the cold. A few survivors tried their best to help, but many had already passed away. The severe weather conditions were obstructing these brave rescue efforts. There was no communication. The blizzard surrounding the plane wreckage was so intense that contacting the outside world was impossible. In such isolation, the survivors had no choice but to rely on each other. With the first light of dawn, the survivors quickly began to explore inside and around the wreckage of the plane. They tried to climb the mountains to examine the crash site and find the nearest help. However, the steep terrain and intense snowstorms made every step more difficult. Slopes, rocks, and snow-covered areas made walking nearly impossible. After several hours of climbing, the group had made no progress. The snow falling on them was further complicating their survival. In these conditions, something that seemed like a simple walk could become fatal. The passengers decided to use everything they had left to survive. They shared the remaining food in the plane, even the smallest amounts. They tried to treat the injured with the limited medical supplies, but these were insufficient. A few individuals attempted to climb the mountain to find a rescue team that could save them, but the snowstorm was so severe that they had to turn back. As the days passed, the cold and snow increasingly wore down the survivors. The food ran out and the temperature continued to drop. A group of survivors tried to stay alive by wrapping themselves in the few blankets and clothes left in the wreckage. Some continued their determined climb up the mountain to seek help, but the snowstorm sent them back each time. There was no communication, no hope, and no outside help. The survivors continued to rely only on each other to stay alive. Many realized that the key to survival was simply being patient and fighting to survive each day. However, with each passing day, the number of survivors dwindled, and in the cold, dark, and silent Andes Mountains, the struggle for survival grew harder by the minute. The days following the crash were like a tunnel of time for the group that survived in the Andes. The wreckage of the plane was surrounded by snow-covered mountains and everything was blanketed in white. Slowly, the snowy peaks of the mountains seemed to become more distant with every passing minute, appearing like an increasingly unreachable hope. The initial shock of the crash had worn off, but the fight for survival had become more difficult than ever. Food and water sources were depleted, and the weather conditions were growing increasingly harsh. Only the snow and cold seemed to follow them with every step. At first, the survivors had tried to gather their strength by sharing the small amount of food they could find in the plane. Most of them subsisted on small snacks, canned drinks, and food from emergency kits. However, none of these foods provided a long-term solution, and they were not nutritious enough to sustain their survival. As the days passed, the people within the group began to feel hungrier and weaker. There were no water sources, and the snow was not clean enough to drink. A few people tried to use the melting snow as drinking water, but this only provided temporary relief. After a while, some individuals rapidly weakened due to hunger and malnutrition. Their bodies began to slow down due to the lack of energy needed for survival. The efforts to find food and water only made them feel more and more exhausted. They were so hungry that with each passing day, their strength to endure was fading. At night, the cold winds wrapped around their bodies, making sleep nearly impossible. Instead of hope, despair and fear began to appear in their eyes. At that moment, every survivor not only faced a physical battle to stay alive, but also a psychological one. As the days passed, the morale of the survivors quickly deteriorated. There was no communication, no help was coming, and no one outside was doing anything to rescue them. The group, which had once given each other hope, began to drift apart. Many had lost hope of survival. They now thought that staying alive was only a brief passage of time. The bonds between them were weakening with the cold and darkness. Hunger, cold, and despair accelerated the physical collapse on one side, while on the other, they hastened the mental breakdown. The survivors felt as though they were going mad from sleep deprivation and fear. No one trusted each other, and everyone was fighting their own battle in isolation. Some passengers felt so overwhelmed by hunger and psychological exhaustion that they began to see survival not just as living, but even breathing became a torment. Their only thoughts were of which method might take them one step further, and how much longer this ordeal would last. During this time, one of the leaders within the group gathered a few people together and tried to encourage them. This person was one of the most resilient and leader-like figures in the group. As everyone's hope had faded, this person decided to take a few brave steps each night. To rekindle the hope in the eyes of the others, they began making motivational speeches. What will keep us alive is only our determination. There is no help coming from the outside, but we will not leave each other. We must hold on to each other, they said, trying to give courage to the others. These words managed to encourage a few members of the group, but most of the survivors could not believe them. Trust was nearly gone. Looking into each other's eyes, no one truly trusted anyone else. Still, the morale speeches given by the leader, though they seemed like small crumbs of hope, helped people take one more step forward. Although the survivors were initially skeptical, these kinds of talks began to instill optimism in some. But this was only a temporary comfort. The reality was harsher. Over time, the tension within the group increased. The scarcity of food and water made every individual and every action more tense. Those who had been close before now acted like rivals, with no trace of their former friendship. We have nothing left to share in terms of food and water, they would say, sometimes blaming others or even forming groups that became hostile toward each other. In order to ensure their safety, people began to distrust one another within the group. These kinds of conflicts further darkened the souls of those trying to find a way to survive. Each individual harbored doubts about how well the others could endure and searched for different ways to ensure their own safety. In this situation, even in places where solidarity was needed, a kind of struggle between them would arise. However, the harsh conditions pushed each person to a different level. Methods of communication, even with a simple glance, became increasingly meaningful. The survival efforts continued with brief, silent, but effective agreements. On one side, hunger and cold; on the other, the instinct to survive within the human soul. The harsh conditions turned every moment into a frightening and uncertain struggle. However, the moral support of a leader within the group and their mutual bond continued to keep the survivors together. Amid doubts and fears, they clung to each other and struggled to survive in this brutal fight. Although hunger, cold, and fear brought them closer, the solidarity within the group was constantly being tested. Sometimes this solidarity provided temporary relief, but without a stronger hope, this grueling battle for survival continued with only short-term solutions. The time since the crash became a period where the survivors reached the peak of not only their physical, but also their psychological collapse. Initially, the group had tried to encourage one another, But as time passed, they were forced to make more radical decisions to stay alive. Food had run out, and water sources had dwindled to almost nothing. At night, the cold and fatigue consumed their bodies, and with each passing day they felt increasingly hopeless. A week later, they faced another horrifying reality. There was no food left. They were about to face a moment when the hardest decisions would have to be made. Everything left from the plane's emergency kits was used up. The hours spent in darkness were dragging the group closer to exhaustion. Their bodies were weakening slowly, and with every step they were losing more energy. If no help came from the outside, survival seemed impossible. At that moment, the limits of solidarity were about to be tested. One morning, a conversation began among a few group members about a dark decision. The bodies of the dead could, unfortunately, become another source of survival for the living. At first, no one wanted to believe this. They looked at each other with fear, concern, and doubt in their eyes. It was a thought that was completely unnatural, something extremely hard to accept. Eating human flesh was far more terrifying than facing death itself. However, over time, everyone realized that this horrifying idea was becoming more and more realistic and inevitable. For several hours, silence reigned among the group. No one could bring themselves to explain this decision to anyone. Many people, even after the decision was made, still refused to accept it. To feed off the bodies of the dead felt like a contamination, a betrayal in the truest sense of the word. Most considered eating human flesh to be akin to death itself. However, the bodies were weakening with each passing hour. And was this the only way to survive? Some survivors fought their conscience and opposed the idea, while others saw it as the only solution to stay alive. One group refused to target a single body and looked for other ways, but none were found. Gradually, this idea gained reality. People began to accept this horrific thought in order to survive. One group decided to feed off the bodies, and this decision became a huge moral burden. Those who objected found it difficult to accept, while for those in doubt the decision was becoming clearer with each passing minute. Fear filled everyone's eyes. This decision came with the fear of not only losing their survival, but also their humanity. "We have to do this," some passengers said, trying to convince the group by explaining this horrific truth. Indeed, in order to survive, they needed the bodies of others. Many survivors struggled to accept this idea. Most feared losing the most fundamental emotions of being human as they looked into each other's eyes while searching for food in the dark. Thoughts of suicide, lost hopes, and the rapid weakening of their bodies all pulled them deeper into despair. Thus, cracks began to form within the group. Some refused to eat the bodies, while others accepted that there was no other way to survive. Sometimes some members of the group accepted this as just a forced choice to survive, but they continued to battle with their consciences. Many felt deep guilt over their previous decisions and choices. On this thin line between life and death, they had no choice but to do something unnatural. An internal collapse was taking place, and with each passing minute, the effects of this collapse became more evident. Many found it difficult to accept this horrifying decision and began feeding off the bodies. However, after a while, a clear division emerged among the survivors. Those who decided to feed off the bodies were, in a sense, the ones fighting for survival. Others felt that this decision was choking their consciences and refused to go down that path. Some thought they would one day return and pay the price for this horrifying decision. However, in that moment, survival was the more immediate concern. During this period, many of the survivors began to feed on the bodies of the dead just to stay alive. Though it disgusted them, they had to gather strength physically. Every decision made things even more difficult within the group. Trust was lost, and each person on one hand was trying to save their life, while on the other hand, they were confronting their conscience and human values. As time passed, this horrific decision did not make the survivors stronger. On the contrary, it continued to emotionally wear them down. However, this decision also marked a point showing how far people would go to survive. Feeding on the bodies only allowed them to survive in the short term, but it never healed them spiritually. An inner emptiness and psychological collapse continued. In the end, the group decided to continue surviving under these harsh conditions. Many were battling hunger and cold, while also struggling with their consciences, but they had no choice but to accept that they had to move forward. For them, life was not a gift, but a fight. And for those who decided to feed on the bodies, this fight had, in a way, led them into the darkest part of the survival path. As time went on, the cold and snow-covered landscape of the Andes had turned into a prison for the survivors. Their bodies had weakened, and their mental breakdowns deepened. Horrific decisions had been made, and the survivors were drifting through the mountains like ghosts. Around the wreckage of the plane, more and more people died with each passing day. Feeding on the bodies once seen as a choice had now become a decision made simply for survival. Despite everything, some survivors still wanted to see a glimmer of hope that these nightmare-filled days would come to an end. Hope was, in fact, the thing they needed most, and it was reborn with the initiation of a difficult journey to the top of the mountains. Days of cold, snow, and hunger had brought them to the brink of exhaustion. The ever-changing weather, the increasing snowstorms with each step, and the challenging winds were testing the survivors both physically and psychologically. But at some point, most of the remaining survivors were searching for one last resort to stay alive. A group of brave passengers gathered the rest of the survivors and said, "We must climb to the top of the mountains." This was a decision that required the greatest courage. The wreckage they left behind seemed like a protective shelter, but, at the same time, it was now just the last remnants of their existence. If no help was coming, they had to climb to find a hope of salvation outside. Setting aside their fears, fatigue, and hunger, they made the decision to embark on a difficult journey toward the top of the mountains. The group began to climb from the foothills to the peaks with their limited resources. Many did not know if they would survive this journey. The mountains were so high, and the conditions so harsh, that the possibility of an avalanche, a falling rock, or an accident was always present. Nevertheless, with all other options exhausted, they were driven to act. Over time, a sense of solidarity and determination to survive together formed among this brave group. They walked together, supported each other, and searched for more hope with every step. As they climbed toward the summit, each step felt like a victory. The snow grew thicker with each passing day, the mountains became steeper, and the air grew colder. Most of the travelers had pushed their bodies to the limit. Fatigue and hunger seemed to follow them step by step. The first few days of the climb felt like a survival struggle. Each day was filled with a few hours of sleep, sharing meager rations, and having conversations to encourage one another. The cold affected them not only physically but also mentally. At any moment they felt like they might fall, but they never considered turning back. One of the challenges they faced during the climb was the deepening snow and the slowly decreasing oxygen levels. Their bodies were weakening with each step, but there was something that kept pushing them forward. Hope. Hope became a renewed source of strength with every step taken from the beginning of the climb. Looking back or giving up was no longer an option. The survivors pressed on, strengthening the bond among them. One day, after hours of difficult climbing, they finally reached a point near the summit. The weather conditions worsened even further, with the snowstorm nearly obscuring all visibility. Each step felt like a miracle. They were shivering from the cold, but somehow trying to stay on their feet. Behind the snow-covered peaks, the survivors of the group continued to push forward with what seemed like their last ounce of strength. Each individual moved with the last of their inner energy. One day, near the end of their climb, as they approached the summit, they noticed something. Slowly, the snowstorm began to subside, and at that moment, a group of surviving passengers spotted some movement in the distance. Their hairs stood on end. Unclear figures began to appear in the darkness. In that moment, their entire world changed. A rescue team had finally found them. The team's uniforms, equipment, and radios became a symbol of salvation for these passengers, who had once seemed hopelessly lost. The rescue team quickly approached, moving the survivors to a safer area. After their difficult journey to the mountain's peak, their salvation had arrived. In that instant, the survivors felt a mix of emotions: exhaustion, joy, and most importantly, relief. The fight against death was finally over. As the rescue team members provided first aid and transported them to safety, the survivors watched in astonished happiness, witnessing this miraculous moment. The survivors had finally escaped the cold and terrifying conditions of the mountains. Though the number of survivors had dwindled at the end of this challenging journey, they had found a glimmer of hope. In times when hope seemed lost, this brave group had managed to survive by working together and discovering the strength within each of them. This journey became not only a story of survival but also of surpassing one's limits. Each step was like searching for light in the dark. That light finally shone. After the tragic crash in the Andes, salvation for the surviving passengers could not come without cost. The news of rescue from the mountaintop brought only a momentary relief, but everything left behind had left deep marks in the minds and bodies of the survivors, like the ruins of a lifetime. Being saved from the crash offered a chance for physical healing, but the psychological trauma would linger for a long time. The survivors had to come to terms not only with the survival, but also with what had come after the nightmare. The arrival of the rescue teams was a sort of second birth for the survivors. Once their basic human needs, food, water, and warmth, were met, their bodies found some comfort. However, many still carried the physical traces of the crash. The time spent in the cold and snow had quickly weakened and drained them. Every step, every ounce of weight their bodies carried took them back to the dark days of the past. Broken bones, frozen skin, injuries sustained during the climb were all quickly treated by the rescue teams, but these marks would never disappear. Many would undergo long periods of treatment to return to normal life. Though their bodies healed, the mental and emotional collapse they experienced would take much longer. Traumatic events often leave deeper scars than physical wounds. The heavy burden of the crash would remain as a more painful memory for the survivors than even the deaths they had witnessed. In the days immediately following the crash, the survivors spent their time grappling with uncertainty. Their physical needs had been met, but the real battle was psychological. The hunger, cold, fear, and constant threat of death they had endured left indelible marks in their minds. Many felt guilty after the crash, believing they were responsible for the deaths of their lost friends. Many of the survivors carried a deep sense of guilt within them. To survive, they had fed on the bodies of the dead, and every passing day they felt the weight of this decision more profoundly. A group of survivors struggled with this burden for years. As they carried the memories of their lost friends, living with the label of the survivors became increasingly difficult. Many felt that carrying the traces left by the dead emotionally drained them. Yet, they knew that in order to move forward in life, they needed to heal spiritually. This meant taking steps like starting therapy or joining support groups. It was about facing the fears of the past and finding a healthier path for their future. After the crash, the survivors frequently remembered their lost friends. They held on to everything they remembered about their lives before the crash: the laughter, the kind words, and the shared goals, keeping them alive within themselves. Many of the survivors from the very beginning of the crash tried to hold on to the promises they had made to each other amidst the wreckage and the bodies of their lost friends. Their bond became the only real thing for those who remained, for many of the survivors carrying the memories of their lost friends, especially those who perished during the crash or the difficult climb, felt like a heavy burden. Many of these memories were mixed with trauma, and at times, instead of bringing them peace, they deepened their pain. Some of the survivors mentioned their lost friends' names every day, showing that they had not forgotten them. However, this also meant reliving the pain over and over again. Losing loved ones even after surviving often exacts the heaviest toll. Yet despite all the suffering and hardship, the survivors of the Andes Mountains demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. Surviving was not just a physical achievement, but also required immense mental strength. Each survivor, after recovering from the shock of the crash, eventually rediscovered their own power. The pain had profoundly affected them, but over time they realized that their survival had become a symbol of the endurance of the human spirit. By supporting each other, the group worked together to heal from the trauma. They were no longer just people who survived a disaster. They were individuals who had managed to cope with the psychological burden of survival, coming together and becoming stronger as a result. Their bond with each other had only deepened after the crash. No one was alone in this brutal battle for survival. The survivors, not only through mutual support but also by rediscovering the fundamental emotions and connections of humanity, became a symbol of salvation. After the crash, the lives of the survivors would never be the same. The physical and psychological trauma they experienced was reflected in each of their daily lives. Many fought an internal battle for years to overcome the effects of the crash. Yet each of them won the battle to survive, strengthened by the bonds they found in each other, even in the most difficult circumstances. Survival, while seeming like freedom, also meant paying the price for the pain and loss they had endured. Each survivor put in a great deal of effort to start again after the crash. They realized that survival was not just a physical journey, but an emotional one as well. Their connection to themselves, each other, and the memories of their lost friends became a healing force over time. This was not only a story of survival, but also a powerful lesson on the strength of the human spirit. In the end, the tragedy in the Andes taught each of the survivors how fragile and valuable life truly is. Though the painful weight of the crash would deeply affect them and take time to heal, these memories would never be erased from their minds. However, the lessons they learned from the horrific event and their unwavering bond with each other had taught them how to find hope even in life's darkest moments.